It's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is I've got a bunch of great albums for my year-end countdown today. The bad news is we had to deal with 2020 to get them. The top 10 best albums of 2020 are here, and we'll count them down next on Track by Track. Hey everybody, my name's Kyle and this is Track by Track, music reviews, news, and commentary. Thanks for tuning in today, and if this is your first time here, please take a second to click subscribe so that you won't miss future reviews and more. What a year it has been. On the one hand, we've been dealing with a global pandemic that has resulted in the near total absence of live music, with concert venues everywhere forced to close their doors. But on the other hand, we've seen artists around the world finding creative inspiration and releasing singles, EPs, and albums to help them and their fans cope with these crazy times. It's hard for me to remember a single year when we saw so much new music from some of rock's biggest names, including the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Paul McCartney, David Gilmour, Bruce Springsteen, and AC/DC. On top of that, it was a year of surprise releases, with records from Ryan Adams, Fiona Apple, and not one but two albums from Taylor Swift seemingly coming from out of nowhere. As I look back at all of the releases we saw in 2020, both planned and unplanned, putting together my best of the year list, there's no shortage of great music to consider. But I also have to wonder what my list would have looked like if there hadn't been a pandemic. In all likelihood, there's a number of artists that had anticipated putting out new albums in 2020, but have delayed their plans until the world returns to some sense of normalcy. Touring behind a new album is fairly standard, but that simply wasn't possible in 2020. That's a significant factor in why Foo Fighters bumped their new album to next year. We were also expecting one or perhaps even two new albums from The Cure, a band well known for turning their live shows into major music events. Perhaps we'll finally see that happen again in the new year. How many other acts pressed pause on new releases in 2020 though? And does that mean we could be in store for an epic year of music in 2021? Getting back to 2020 though, we still had plenty of releases to be happy about. And before I start my countdown, I'm obligated to offer my usual annual disclaimer, which is to say that this is ultimately my favorite albums of the year, which will naturally align closely to my own personal taste. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you won't be surprised that the rap or R&B albums that have ranked high on other year-end lists will be absent from mine. Otherwise, there's just one high-profile album that's not on my list that I feel like I should comment on, and that's Folklore by Taylor Swift. It's an album that seems to have landed on many top 10 lists this year, even topping some. I'll give credit where credit is due and say I actually thought it was a very good album, but it's not one of my top 10 of the year. Simple as that. So let's get the countdown started, shall we? Suffice it to say, you will likely have heard of all of the albums or artists in my top 10, with the exception of the album at number 10, and that's From Nothing to Nothing by Scalise. This is the debut album from an independent Minneapolis-based folk rock act. Now, I don't do reviews of indie acts on this channel because sadly what I've found is that most people won't watch videos about bands they've never heard of. But I do listen to indie bands, and in the case of Scalise, they legitimately released one of my favorite albums of the year. So I'm excited to be able to share it with you. Scalise is a six-piece band with both male and female lead singers, as well as a horn section. The band's primary songwriter, Graydon Hill, cites influences as varied as legends like John Lennon and the band to more contemporary acts like Jack White and Conor Oberst. Hill tells me they're sometimes compared to Brandi Carlile, Houndmouth, and The Head and the Heart. To my ear, they've got a sound that calls to mind a bit of Nickel Creek, with a touch of both Dave Matthews Band and Counting Crows. One thing I have to say I'm struck by is how, for a band this young, they are making such mature musical choices. There's so many unexpectedly nuanced moments on this album, with everything so well balanced, it's a perfect coffeehouse blend. There's a lot of great and well-known acts still to come on this year's top 10 list, but if there's one entry I truly hope you take the time to seek out, it's this one. From Nothing to Nothing by Scalise is streaming on both Spotify and Apple Music, and I'll include links down in the description below. Coming in at number 9 on my year-end list is a band that makes me really miss live music. Dawes seem to be making annual visits to one of my local live venues, and they've always put on a great show. Even though I didn't find their 2018 album to be one of their best, it still translated well live. But 2020's Good Luck With Whatever was a different story. This year's model was full of great tracks that just begged to be played live. From the rocking and relatable Still Feel Like a Kid that opens the album, to the solo acoustic St. Augustine at Night, Good Luck With Whatever delivers on every element that makes them one of my favorite current music acts. Here's hoping they'll be back on stage at my local concert hall and many others across the country in 2021. Of course, another artist that had some big plans get delayed by COVID in 2020 was Alanis Morissette. Not only had she planned a major tour for the 25th anniversary of her landmark album Jagged Little Pill, she also had a brand new album to play as well. After an 8-year absence, Such Pretty Forks in the Road was in many ways a comeback album for Alanis. But what I think I liked most about it was how well it contrasted against Jagged Little Pill. Both albums represent very different moments in time. Both Alanis and her fans are likely in very different places in their lives compared to when You Oughta Know was taking over the world. Such Pretty Forks in the Road is an album that, like Pill, many listeners will see themselves reflected in its songs. After 25 years, we've all been through some shit, and it's both refreshing and cathartic to hear Alanis can still so effectively speak to those experiences. Landing at number 7 on my year-end countdown is the surprise album by Ryan Adams. Wednesdays is easily the most raw and emotional album in Adams' discography. That fact, among others, makes it a challenging listen at times. The mood on this thing borders on oppressively depressing sometimes, yet it is also exquisitely and earnestly executed. I'm reminded of how Ryan closed his Live at Carnegie Hall album with the sad sack fan favorite Come Pick Me Up, and then jokingly quips to the audience afterward, "Now you're sad." That's kind of what you get with Wednesdays, too. Quite possibly the saddest album of 2020. Some fans have called it a masterpiece. I'm not quite going to go there with my ranking, but it's a very solid effort just the same. Now, while the Ryan Adams album was a surprise release, the album at number 6 on my list is the release that most surprised me. Power Up by AC/DC was exactly the kind of album 2020 desperately needed. And while it's probably true that the album enjoyed a bit of a lift from a world that needed a return to this kind of rock and roll, it would be unfair to credit all its success to a rock-starved COVID audience. Power Up would have been a great rock record in any year, a better album than I think anyone even expected. It definitely exceeded my expectations. And on top of that, if I was giving out awards for best CD packaging, this deluxe edition would win first prize. So great. As we turn the corner into the top 5, we find the legendary Paul McCartney with his quote-unquote rock-down album, McCartney 3. This is yet another 2020 album that exceeded my expectations. Unlike Paul's recent studio albums that found him working with today's hottest producers and cranking out music that seemed to veer a bit too close to mainstream vanilla, McCartney 3 feels more authentically Paul than anything he's released in years. Left largely to his own devices, Paul solidly demonstrates that his musical talents and intuitions are far better realized on his own. Where 2018's Egypt Station was clearly a contemporary effort, McCartney 3 aims for timeless, and more often than not, hits that target. Coming in at number 4 is Fetch the Bolt Cutters by Fiona Apple. For me, this was one of the most challenging albums of the year. I'd actually intended to review it here on the channel, but never did, primarily because it took me a really long time to fully explore this music. There's a lot going on this album, and perhaps more than any other entry in my top 10, it is quite simply not a casual listen. Fetch the Bolt Cutters demands your attention. Even after dozens of plays, I don't think I can put this on as background music. There's some great storytelling in these songs, balanced against a sonic soundscape that truly rewards headphone listening. But if there's one thing I hate, it's the title. Cribbed from a quote from a TV show, Fetch the Bolt Cutters, the album title, is the most unoriginal thing about one of the year's most otherwise original albums. Jason Isbell is no stranger to my year-end lists. His 2017 album, The Nashville Sound, landed at number 4 in my top 10 that year, and now in 2020 we find Reunions one notch higher at number 3. Once again, Jason Isbell delivers a collection of some of the most vividly cinematic songs of the year, each with a keen sense of storytelling and character building that feels intimate and earnest. And similar to Dawes earlier on this year's list, this is the kind of music I can't wait to see live in 2021. We're up to the number 2 album of 2020 now, and it belongs to a track-by-track channel and audience favorite. Rough and Rowdy Ways by Bob Dylan is the album I wasn't sure if the man still had in him. After a trio of covers albums, I was starting to wonder if Bob Dylan's days as a master songsmith were behind him. Rough and Rowdy Ways put those fears to rest. I've already said a lot about this album in my review earlier in the year, so I don't want to repeat myself on the album's many virtues. But something I find interesting is the contrast of this album against Paul McCartney's 2020 album that landed earlier on this list. Dylan is just a year older than McCartney, but one thing that I think has served Bob well is how he's long since embraced his age and he's tailored his music to complement it. On McCartney 3, we hear Paul dabble a little with allowing himself to, shall we say, sound his age. That's worked well for Dylan in my opinion, and I'd love to see Paul follow his lead. Rough and Rowdy Ways is a prime example of how well that approach can work. All right, here we are at the number 1 album of 2020. And I have to say that although it came out back in June and I knew it was top 10 material, it was a companion EP released in November that really elevated it to the number 1 spot. Punisher is the sophomore solo album from Phoebe Bridgers, and it's a collection of songs that has grown on me more than any other album this year. At first listen, I didn't find Punisher as engaging as Bridgers' 2017 debut, Stranger in the Alps, an album that ranked 6th on that year-end list. But what I found as I kept listening was that Punisher runs so much deeper. There's a level of brutally honest and revealing songwriting going on here that at times feels almost invasive to listen to, like I'm reading her private diary entries. And if you don't get that from the album itself, try listening to the companion EP entitled Copycat Killer. There, Bridgers strips down several of the songs to intimate string arrangements that bring the storytelling into such vivid focus that it's absolutely breathtaking. It made me go back to Punisher, an album I already loved, and appreciate it on a much deeper level. It's one of the most stirring and moving albums of the year, which is why Phoebe Bridgers takes the top spot for the best album of 2020. So there you have it, the top 10 albums of 2020. No doubt it has been a crazy year, but at least we've gotten some pretty great music out of it. But now it's your turn. What are your favorite albums of 2020? What were the albums that surprised you the most? Which ones were overrated? And which ones that you were looking forward to ended up letting you down? Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Once again, my name's Kyle and this has been Track by Track. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Plus check out some of these other videos below that I think you might also enjoy. And of course, be sure to click subscribe because true music fans always want new releases the day they come out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.